Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Spring, we're here, almost. Very excited to welcome this crew here. We've got Bailey back. How you doing? He's doing us. We'll get back to him. Emily, what's going on?
Hello.
Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Nashville right now, where it is 80 degrees.
There you go. Summer. There you go. Skip the strength. Go to summer.
Yeah, definitely.
It's been the same here. I think it was 80. It might have hit 90 already in Vegas.
Mm.
Yep. Missed that lovely 75 middle ground. Steve-O, what's happening?
Hi. It's almost 80 degrees here as well.
Right on. Your hair looks nice.
Thank you. I got my summer cut.
Yeah, that's good. It's a good look.
Finally vaccinated, so I wanted to have my hair cut in over a year.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Well done. Aaron, your haircut also looks great.
Going for that side bushwhack look.
There you go. Look at that. You do have a plant. All right. What's going on over there? You're in Seattle?
I actually am in Seattle right now. I leave tomorrow to head back to balmy Baltimore, but Seattle is treating us very nice with this 64-degree weather.
Okay.
So
cool.
Yeah.
And Bailey, you're at home, Connecticut?
I'm in Connecticut. Yeah, we just got back from Colorado. So
nice.
Yeah, it's beautiful in Connecticut right now. I think we're about 70 degrees and sunny. So getting some sun.
What are we doing in Colorado?
I got a haircut too, just like Aaron.
Yay, Bailey. Thank you very much.
What were you doing in Colorado?
We have a house in Boulder, so we were chilling out in Boulder for the winter, which is our favorite thing to do.
Nice.
And then we're about to start on Friday. We're firing up my new distillery in Connecticut. So
it's happening.
The first time this Friday. Timely.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Don't blow anything up,
Yeah, I'll try not to. Try not to blow up the neighbors.
Yep. That's always a positive. I'm sure they appreciate that. All right, let's get to it here, guys. We'll see everybody else in a little bit. So the topic, rum, the first global spirit. Very excited to see this. And there's a lot of discussion in your summary here about how this is not a branded presentation. So stoked about that. As usual, chat box and questions. Feel free to hit us up either via Facebook, Crowdcast, or otherwise. And please do share. Presentation 30 to 40. We're flipping the cocktail session first, and then we'll get back to Emily with 5 questions. A little background, Bailey, you've been here before, but just for anybody who hasn't seen you on, writer, producer, director, film and TV for over 25 years. Produced 7 feature films, over 150 television programs, received 17 Emmy nominations, winning 7 for his work on PBS. Founder CEO of Real McCoy, based on a film you produced of the same name, and it's won over 100 major spirits industry awards, distributed in 50 states, 10 countries worldwide. So, I got a lot of work to do to build a resume like that, So I'll see what I can do over here, but stoked to have you as always. Tell us what you're making over there cocktail-wise.
Well, I got a fun cocktail for you today. We're doing what we're calling the Passionista. And so it's basically passion fruit daiquiri, if you think of it that way.
I got it right here, actually.
Yeah, I can share my screen with you if you want. But yeah, that's it. So it's 2 ounces of Real McCoy 12-year. 2 ounces of fresh passion fruit juice, ½ ounce of lime. If you're using actual passion fruit, you don't have to add that lime component. And then a little bit of simple. And that's what I was doing right before we started rolling today. Perfect. Was getting the simple syrup done. So I've got some rum, our little 12-year, a couple ounces of that. Oh, here we go. Let me get all this stuff together. And then we've got a little bit of in this case, we actually have real passion fruit puree, which I'm very excited about. So we're not going to do the lime, but for anybody making this at home, if you're using passion fruit juice, they usually sweeten the juice. So feel free to do a little bit of the lime if you have the juice, or you can just go with that. And then here's a little bit of the simple syrup as we discussed in the recipe. Very easy. Give it a little shake. Try not to spray it all over my computer. And we have
this is the first cocktail I've seen you make. That's pretty exciting here.
Yeah. And I'll start up with a little cocktail. So
I love passion fruit the most.
Me too.
It really is such a delicious flavor.
Me too. And it's really fun to do this at this, in the spring when we're coming out of hibernation. It's really nice to have a nice little passion fruit cocktail. So cheers, everybody.
Cheers. Well, I wish I was making one, but looks lovely.
Right on. So if you want, I can take you guys into the little conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
This is based on a lot of information that I've collected over the years, and had great conversations with people who are very knowledgeable in their territory. So, there's so much to rum, and it's such an incredibly diverse environment. The category is incredibly complicated, and there's a lot to it. Similar to whiskey in that you have bourbon and Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Scotch whiskey, on and on and on and on with all these different elements within the category. You have the same thing with rum. You've got rum agricole, you have claret, you have cachaça, you've got molasses-based rums and so on. So I thought it would be fun to kind of put together a little piece that just sort of talks about some of that, but also why they've ended up the way they have, and what is the technology that leads to their individual styles over the years. So we're going to study that a little bit. So let me just share my screen with you guys. Here we go. Hope this is going to work.
It's there. Feel good about it.
You guys got it? Okay.
No, we don't have it actually.
You're not seeing it right now?
No.
Uh-oh. Okay. Mine's saying share. Here we go. Let me try it again.
There it is.
Okay. So if I do that, now you got it?
Yes, we got it. We're with you.
Sorry.
You look great no matter what. I'll tell you if you got something in your ear.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I just found this to be really fun. We learned a little bit about who I am, and here's the Passionista cocktail. If anybody wants to grab a screenshot of that again, so you can make this one at home. But the thing that I wanted to go into was the fact that, how big this category is in rum, and how global it is. And that always struck me as something very interesting, that we have such an unbelievably complicated category, but really the history of rum is the history of, modern alcohol. And so I just found it to be a pretty fascinating thing. There's more varieties, production methods, and geographic identities than vodka, tequila, and brandy combined. You could probably add a few more spirits in there also. It's a global spirit that's produced around the world, and it's widely misunderstood. Most people, think that rum is rum. And they think that rum has no rules. And you hear people saying these things all the time. Rum's the Wild West. It has no rules. When in fact, there's rules in every rum making nation. In the same way that, we don't really look at whiskey and say, well, whiskey has no overarching international rules, because it doesn't. And neither does rum, because whiskey is made in Scotland by the Scottish rules, and Ireland by the Irish rules, and Canada by the Canadian rules, and in the bourbon region, in Kentucky by their rules, in the same way that cachaça is made in Brazil by their rules, and rum agricole in Martinique by their rules, and in Barbados and Jamaica by their rules, and Haiti and so on. So all of those things make sense when you start to kind of look at it in the similar light. So I think part of the reason why we all know so much about whiskey categories and we don't know about rum categories is because we've never, the big industry in rum has never really focused on the attributes of rum, the techniques, the processes, the history, the culture, the traditions. They've just been talking about rum as like light and dark, and talk about parties and talk about, aliens and sea monsters and things like that, rather than, well, it's made with these particular attributes and made in these particular ways. So that's why I think there's this lag in category understanding.
Yeah, I think I would add to that what I've seen so much of is brands telling their own story.
Yeah.
Kind of just off on an island. This is our story. Nothing else is relevant. And not wanting to have a broader conversation, which I think is such a miss, because when you have the context, it's just empowering. It gets people more excited about the broader macro category when you can understand the depth to all that, you know?
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to do this presentation without any branding, really, to kind of celebrate all of these categories and all of our friends that we've become, you know, close with over the years across the rum spectrum. You know, you, Pete, and other folks in the category that are making really beautiful spirits all around the world. And this is a chance to kind of clear that up for anybody who isn't familiar with some of this background. So, you know, rum comes from obviously distillation, and the big idea in distillation began about 2000 BC for the production of perfumes and aromatics. It's suggested that it began in Mesopotamia. So the Arabs were using it to make perfumes, basically. And in the Middle East, they really refined this over the centuries and came up with alcohol, which is alcohol as we know it, and the pot still that we're so familiar with is called the alembic pot still, and that's circa around 800 AD. And you know, it's an interesting device that was originally developed to extract aromatics to make perfumes, and in this case, later it became understood that you could do make drinking alcohol from it. Albertus Magnus was the first to describe it in detail about 800 and 900 years ago, and he wrote about it and actually discussed its uses. Arnoldus Villanova in 1315 was also really interested in elaborately describing aqua vitae, which is life water, and he talked about it being health-inducing and clearing away ill humors and reviving the heart and maintaining youth, and it was literally, you know, the fountain of youth. So people have gone into pretty elaborate discussions about alcohol, and I think they just kind of get to that euphoric stage maybe while they're drinking and writing at the same time. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if those health claims have been validated per se.
Yeah, the TTB in America tries everything they can to stop anybody from making health claims, but there you go.
Yeah.
But my favorite is this gentleman, this German physician named Hieronymus Bunschweig, who's he thought that alcohol cured baldness, and that it killed body lice, that it eliminated belching, which I think it kind of contributes to it, but hey, that's just me. And that it cured all stinking wounds, which I think is fabulous. That I do believe that alcohol will cure all stinking wounds. So I think it's one of those things that we shouldn't look down on that particular attribute. But I think it's really fun that you have this history, this rich history that goes back. In the Caribbean, the history goes back very far as well. It's kind of ironic about Christopher Columbus being the first person to actually bring sugarcane to the Caribbean. It's not indigenous to the Caribbean rim. So you did not have sugarcane there before 1493. And the irony there is that Columbus was going to the Caribbean in order to discover, to find the gold in the city, the fabled city, El Dorado, which was supposed to be this entire city made of gold, and he was going to go get the gold and bring it back to the Queen of Spain. And what he didn't realize was that by bringing sugarcane to the West, that sugarcane would be planted, people would start farming it, they would make refined sugar, and then the price of sugar actually at one point in history became more valuable per ounce than the price of gold. So he literally had the gold with him on the boat as he was coming to North America, Central America to find gold. So in 1640 is when rum production is first documented, and that was in Barbados. And so people talk about Barbados being the birthplace of rum for that reason, because it's the oldest known document at this time to actually discuss rum production techniques and processes. And it was done in combination with sugar production. So people, I've heard lots of people talk about and speculate on, sugar came first and then rum came later and all that kind of stuff. But it seems to be that in 1640, they were doing them side by side. So they knew about rum and they knew about the distillation techniques, and they were doing that at the same time. And actually, Richard Seale was the one who uncovered the majority of that information that I've learned. So by the 18th century, cane farming became very popular in the Caribbean, and you started to build a real industry for sugar globally, which the British dominated. But the global market for sugar was, caused the price of sugar to just skyrocket, and that's when, in the middle of the 18th century, that's when the price of sugar was so incredibly high that you were able to, sell it for a better price than an ounce of gold. So whiskey producers from Scotland and Ireland were imported to Barbados and Jamaica to make rum. Primarily Scotland. I've heard a couple people from Ireland that were associated with still manufacturing, and later those were brought to the islands, depending on their which island was using which technique. In the French islands, the cognac producers were sending down technology and technicians. The Portuguese were bringing their brandy producers. They went to Martinique and Brazil. And I know, Pete, you can talk about this as well, where the production of rum agricole began in cachaça, and the Spaniards were making claret also at that time. So, in this era, this gold rush, we call it the sugar rush. That era was an era where actually Barbados became the single largest alcohol producing nation in the world, which is hard to imagine when you think there was only about 50,000 people on the island at the time, and they were making more alcohol than any other nation. The European monarchs began fighting over sugar producing islands, which is why you have all these islands down there. There's the French islands and the British islands and the Spanish islands and the Portuguese and the Dutch also had some, and then depending on who had the strongest navies at different times, they would take and retake islands. So there's all these battles going on. It was all over commodity. It was all over money. And this all coincided with the production of sugar, and its byproduct in the case of the Anglophile world was molasses, which was then made into rum. So what ended up happening is as these European monarchs started claiming these territories, they were localizing the production techniques, and that's where it all really began. And let me hang on one second. My battery's dying. Let me just plug in.
Okay, all good. There's some questions here on the chat, but they're being answered on the chat. But if sugarcane was imported, where did it come from, and were people fermenting, distilling it there? And then the answer was Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. So, can you hear us?
There we go. Yeah, hi.
Yeah. Oh, there.
My battery's dying on this computer, so it goes out unexpectedly. Sorry. So the question there was, where did it come from before?
Where did cane originate? And also, was there fermentation distillation going from where cane originated from originally?
Yes, there's discussion about whether it was China or whether it was New Guinea, or basically somewhere else in Southeast Asia where the cane was existing naturally. Right. And it seems that was the case. That's where the sugar cane was originally growing, and I think the real production of rum and that distillation was not happening there. I think that the cane was being brought by the Middle Eastern traders were bringing cane back to the Middle East, and so Mesopotamia was kind of a one territory that has a good amount of information about this, and they were bringing the cane back, and then they started distilling it. And so I've never seen any evidence that there was rum produced in China or anywhere in Southeast Asia before the alembic pot still and the creation of alcohol. It certainly is a possibility. I know that the Chinese did have a still, and probably had that still long before the alembic still, but they were using it for puppet shows. So they would have, it was a steam engine basically. They would get water boiling, and the steam would move these cups, and the cups had puppets on them, and the puppets would go up and down, and people would speak to it, and so one person could have like all these things happening. So I know that the Chinese did have still technology for that purpose. I just haven't seen anything that indicates there was like distillation of alcohol being produced.
Right. One little caveat here, since I'm inside baseball on it, but the earliest evidence of cachaça production, it looks to be 1516 in Brazil. So, and it was pretty rudimentary. And then a little bit later on, there's some evidence. This is dug up by Dave Wondrich. He's got the magic going, what have you, which was Dutch technology that ended up there and started commercializing it into the mid 1500s.
Yeah, so that would have probably been a version of the pot still, I would think.
Totally, 100%. Yeah, which is still very. I mean, artisanal cachaça is almost all pot still.
Yeah.
Sure. There is a lot of very rough column still production that happens on the we call industrial, but pot distillation, alembic pot still is very, very common in usage in Brazil.
Yeah, cool. Well, and that's the tradition of the territory, and that's part of why this history is so important, because everything was the pot still for a certain period of time, and then new technologies came in, like the single column Creole still and things like that. And so I'll get to those in just a second, but it really, I find it very interesting how much the technology has driven the technique and today's version of these products, which in many cases are radically different today than they were made back in the early times.
Yeah.
So like the Anglophone producers in Jamaica and Barbados, they imported copper pot stills from Scotland, and that device is very inefficient at extracting alcohol. So what you're looking at in this picture is called a double retort pot still. That's what those two little cans in the middle there, those are called retorts. And they help to slow down the process and to allow the copper to interact with the alcohol vapor and reduce the speed of the distillation, which will make the product smoother. You're neutralizing sulfur compounds, you're turning acids to bases and things like that. And so before they even had this double retort, which is a Caribbean invention, it was just the alembic pot still with the lin arm and that swan neck going to the condenser. And so that was a very inefficient device at extracting alcohol from a wine, from a molasses wine. And what you ended up with were, tremendous flavor compounds that were developed during fermentation, but then would survive the distillation process. So they would persist through distillation. And these are the products that you hear about in history books about people in the Caribbean calling these products rumbustion and rumbellion because it made people crazy and it tasted wild and people were freaking out all the time. And you hear these same stories in the Netherlands around the same time. And even in the centuries before with gin, they were making Genever over there, and they were doing the same things where they were distilling, and they would have these high concentrated alcohols that were very flavorful, but made people crazy. And in fact, the Pope at two times in history, a Pope has forbid the consumption of alcohol in the 1300s and the 1500s, and that was because basically they thought people were being possessed by spirits, and that's why part of the reason why they're called spirits. So an interesting thing. I suspect that it was because they didn't realize that there was methanol poisoning, and they were basically.
That's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah, they were basically, the first thing, if you don't know, the first thing that comes out of the still once you get it going is methanol. It's the most volatile alcohol. And so the very first thing, even long before you get the solution in the kettle to get to a rolling boil, alcohol vapor will rise up, and the methanol is the first one to rise. And it exists naturally in all beers and wines, but you're just concentrating it when you put it through a still, and that in its concentrated form can do real damage to your body. If you drink it in full concentration, you can die or go blind very easily. And this is what was happening to people during Prohibition who were making products and didn't understand the chemistry when alcohol was forbidden in the United States. But if you do little amounts of this for a long period of time and people drink a lot, then you can actually get different forms of alcohol poisoning that are going to make you go crazy. So we suspect that that's what was going on. So in the process of making sugar, where you cut down a sugarcane stalk and then you crush the stalk and you squeeze out the juice, and now you just have fresh pressed sugarcane juice. And for back in those days, the people who were making sugar, they would just put that in a pot and they would start a fire under the pot and they would boil it and they would smear that solution. It's just making a simple syrup, if you think of it that way. You're reducing it and smearing it up on the sides of the pot, and that's where the crystals would form. And so they would take these sticks and they would roll them around the edge of the bowls, and that would collect with molasses and the sugar, and it would make this stuff that everybody called treacle, which is just sort of a crystalline molasses, if you think of it that way. And they would form in these little conical shapes, and it usually had a hole in the middle of the cone because that's where that stick was, and they would wrap that in paper and ship it off to England or the Americas or something like that. And so that's how they would do it. And over time, they would work with the solution, make as much sugar as they possibly could, and what was left was basically charred molasses. And so that's what people started to distill, and they did it very, very quickly. Immediately in the process of making sugar, they started making rum. So this became the identity of the Anglophone rum producers. So the Jamaicans and the Barbadians who were making this stuff. Oh, here's my cat, Frank. Hi.
Hey.
Say hi to Frank.
Pets. Tiki Tuesday Talks. Always
go over there. Frank's sad. Our dog died yesterday, so Frank's very lonely. He was looking for him today, so very sad. So the distillation process in Jamaica and Barbados became identifiable with molasses, and that's how that began. But the English capitalized on the sugar rush, and they became very, very powerful in the global merchandising of sugar and putting that together, that distribution system. So,
yeah, really, from my understanding, and again, a lot of this is from my learnings from Dave, it really seems like the English were first and foremost very open about entrepreneurship and trade, and it really kind of extended a lot more than many of the other kind of colonial overseers in sugarcane distillation.
Yeah, well, I think you had a free market system in England that was less repressed by the nobility, the monarchy. So you had kind of an open market system, and people were encouraged to go make money so that they could be taxed. So the British really got behind that strategy, and that's what led to so much in global history. But along with that, you had the competitors to the British, which were primarily the French. And the French were allied with Spain and with Portugal. Especially as you get into the late 18th and early 19th century, and Napoleon comes into the picture. They were almost fiefdoms of Napoleon's military might. So at that time, you had some technology being developed that was trying to counter the sugar industry. And so Martinique and Guadeloupe started to bring in stills from France that were single column stills. And this was the invention of the single column still came into place because Napoleon had forbade the French Caribbean farmers from producing sugar because they knew that anybody down the Caribbean making sugar, that sugar would somehow eventually end up in the hands of the British, who had the big global distribution system, and therefore the British would make a profit and use that profit to fight Napoleon. So he said, "You guys can't make sugar," and that's and therefore he, with his farmers in France, everybody wanted sugar in France, but they couldn't get their hands on the British sugar because they weren't allowed to buy it. So they started growing sugar beets, and Napoleon used this type of still that he developed. He had a prize given to whoever could come up with the technology to make it so that we could distill sugar beet and make rum out of that. Really, it was to make sugar out of that, but the byproduct also became the rum. So this is how rum agricole came into existence, from fresh pressed sugarcane juice, not molasses, because they weren't making sugar, so they didn't get the byproduct of sugar making, which was molasses. And that's the history behind that and why that exists. So that single column still is more efficient than the pot still at extracting alcohol. So the pot still will allow all of the flavor compounds, or the majority of the flavor compounds developed during fermentation, to persist into the spirit. But the column still, you can see this picture in the middle, has these little plates. Each one of these is a plate, and each plate is filled with water, and alcohol vapor has to pass through the water. And when it does, it pulls a little bit of the flavor compounds, these congeners, out into the water. And so you get a lighter flavor profile rum with a column still than you do with a pot still. So eventually the global sugar market collapsed in the 18th century, and Spain and Portugal both switched over to sugarcane because at that time they weren't forbade by Napoleon from making sugar, but they decided not to bother with it because there just wasn't a market for it anymore. So they started going with sugarcane juice. So it wasn't, military and governments and things like that. It was really just market conditions that caused cachaça and the Spanish clarins that you find in Haiti to go, to begin with sugarcane juice rather than molasses, because they used to be made with molasses.
Yeah.
And now they're made with, or at this point in the 18th century, they started getting made with sugarcane juice.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fun to learn.
I didn't know the Napoleon piece about him driving that innovation, but yeah, that's definitely what we understand as well. Is certainly it was at least a hybrid of cane and molasses in the beginning of cachaça production, and definitely at this time it truly kind of came into its own as cane only. And to your point, market conditions and innovation with beet sugar and the like. Yeah,
and these kinds of essays like this one that I'm doing here have a by nature end up sort of generalizing certain things. I'm sure there were plenty of people out there that were experimenting with juice who were in the Anglophone world. I'm sure there were plenty of people out there that shouldn't have been making things because of either market conditions or for political reasons, shouldn't have been working with molasses, but they did anyway for various reasons. So I think you're going to get the whole basket there. Right. So when you get down to the brand history, you might find actually that certain brands deviate from this discussion that I have now because they didn't, maybe somebody stayed with molasses or somebody, never worked with molasses and so on. So it just depends on the individual brand that has persisted to this day at this point. But you basically get the idea behind the market conditions. So later on, there were many improvements on the Napoleonic still, which later got called the Creole still, and so Enos Coffey was the Irishman Enos Coffey was the first one to develop the twin column still, which is essentially one really tall single column still, and he just broke it in half because it was just too unruly to have this giant thing, so he put them next to each other. And so he created this twin column still, which was for the first time capable of generating ethanol above 90%. Now he couldn't get to neutral, he couldn't get to 96%, but he could get to 90, 91, 92, and that was a big moment because now you've got a lot more application to this. The Industrial Revolution is coming along, so suddenly fuel is becoming a possibility. So this was a very important decision for a lot of reasons on an industrial scale, not just rum production, but certainly in rum production, but also for other reasons. So by continuously separating these volatile compounds in the column, it came to a real precise element of how you separate these compounds and ultimately get these flavor profiles that you want. So whereas a pot still is operated over time, and the first thing that comes out is the methanol that is poison, so you don't want to drink that. The next thing that comes out is your ethanol. That's your good drinking spirit. That's what you want. And then after that, you start getting your tails. And that happens because the whole time you're increasing the temperature inside the kettle. And when you get to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, you start to boil water. So whatever's in your water supply is now getting in your rum, and that's known as the tails. And so the pot still is a function of time in its production process, but the column still is a function of physical space. So, different people who operate in stills can tap in at any number of plates, plate number 106 or plate number 84, and they can tap in there and get exactly the chemical composition that they're looking for. So this became very, very efficient at extracting alcohol. And so in the 1800s, mid 1800s is when the Barbadians started to adopt this technology. It's possible that they were doing it originally to generate fuel, because we see that there are also chamber stills in Barbados. There's a chamber still at the West Indies Rum Distillery, and chamber stills are for making fuel. They're not designed to make beverage alcohol. So the chamber still became a fuel generation plant, and I think that's probably where this ultimately went. And they could have coincided, or you might have had the chamber first and then later the twin column coffee. But anyway, in the middle 1800s is when they adopted it. And the Barbadians were usually pairing the two, and to this day they still do pair the two. You get a lighter flavor profile from the twin column still, and you get a heavier flavor profile from the pot still. And so when you take those two different stills and you blend them together, you get a very balanced rum. And that's what Barbados is known for, and that's why Barbados became so famous as a producing nation, because their rums are really easy to drink, very, very good, very balanced. And that's the Barbadian tradition. It's molasses-based and balanced two stills. The Jamaicans, on the other hand, totally rejected the column still. They thought it was heresy. And so they just wanted the big, heavy, funky Jamaican pot still rums. And so they stayed out of the column still business until the 1960s, I believe. And that's when you start to see the advent of the twin column still, and now even the multi-column still. So again, it's funny how the market conditions and politics can drive the raw materials, and the technology can drive the identity of the rum. And it really takes these kinds of innovations and these traditionalists saying we're not going to accept this, or other people saying no, we need to be forward thinking, we should accept this, and that's why you end up with these variations.
Very interesting.
So by the 1930s, you get to the multi-column still, which is just another expansion of the single column still, getting larger and larger and larger, and you're now separating even more and more. A lot of the components of a very large multi-column still is to separate compounds that you're not drinking. Like people pull off the turpentine and things like that you can use in paint and other things. So the advent of this device really coincided with other materials within the Industrial Revolution. So you were getting paint materials, you were getting alcohol for fuel, and you were getting drinking alcohol. And it just depended on how you operated the still to do this. This is also the time when they deviated, in some cases, from using copper. Up until the 1930s, the stills were always made with copper because copper was the easiest thing to mold. And you could, just with a hammer, you could bend it and shape it and do all the things that you needed to do. And those shapes are very important. The whole reason why the neck on a pot still starts out wide and gets narrow at the top is because you're trying to create pressure to force that alcohol vapor as it's rising up to start vortexing in that, it's called the swan neck right there, or the lin arm. And when it goes up into that little helmet area, you want it to spin around in there and be slapping against the side of the walls of the copper, because that copper interaction is going to neutralize sulfur compounds. It's going to turn acids to bases. It's going to make the spirit smoother. When you get to the multi-column still, the whole point is high speed. You don't want to slow it down by making these choke points. You want to make as much as you possibly can, as quickly as you possibly can. And in the case of fuel alcohol, why spend all the money on copper when you can, when you're not drinking it? So you don't care if it's harsh tasting. We'll use, other materials, cast iron at first, and then later aluminum and other things. And so beverage alcohol plants are made of copper, and fuel alcohol plants are made of steel. And if you were to ever drink from a fuel alcohol plant, which many of you probably have and didn't know it, you would have to have a rum that has incredible amounts of additives, sugar and things to hide that, and perfumes and stuff to get rid of the sulfur compounds and to get rid of the acid and things like that. So heavily diluted, but super cheap. You can make so much alcohol with these multi-column stills. And this is not to say that everybody who works with multi-column still is making a bad product. They're definitely not. There are people out there working with multi-column stills making a fine product. And they're using copper, not steel. And they're doing specific techniques to get a lot of alcohol quickly, but at a flavor compound component that they like and they want to balance. And so when you get to the Bacardis of the world and the other brands that have very, very large volume, they're never going to be able to make all that rum in a pot still, or even 100 pot stills. So they're going to go with the multi-column still. It makes more sense. And so you end up with light rum. And this is where the whole advent of light rum came from. And the whole discussion about rum, I think, inadvertently wrapped around the invention of this device. Because how do we all talk about rum? Up until, basically 10 years ago, people only talked about rum as light, gold, and dark.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so where did that come from? Like everything that comes out of a still is clear as water. There's nothing that comes out of a still that's not clear as water that wasn't a mistake. So, how does it get its color and what's involved with that? And how does it get this flavor profile, the heavy rums versus the light rums, the light colored rums versus the dark rums. So the people that were moving to this technology were being shunned by the traditionalists. Like in Jamaica, they wouldn't touch the column still until the 1960s. So they thought anybody who's making, out of any column still is heresy. And the Cubans were in the same boat. And in fact, Rafael Arroyo, the very famous gentleman who was he was an educator at the University of Puerto Rico, but also a big rum distiller in his time, probably the most well-written of the rum producers in history. He talks about, the column still being heresy, and something that was to be avoided, and it's not really rum and all this kind of stuff. So you had all these different opinions.
And it's funny because that basically became almost solely associated with it thereafter.
Yeah. And so, but what happened is when the price comes down, then the volume goes up, and the price comes down, then it becomes ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Right. And so these are the people that have the money.
Couple things here. One is there's a common joke about cachaça that's produced in this manner as like, do you put it in your car or do you put it in the glass? Kind of like a ball, right?
Both.
Both. Serves both purposes. There is a question which I think you touched on, but just to clarify it, explain the chamber in greater detail. Why was the design used to produce fuel?
Oh, the chamber still is essentially it's a box. And so the design of the chamber still was just that people didn't want to bend the copper and move it around like that. So what they did was they decided to just use, in some cases, pieces of other stills that had been basically burned out, and they just like cut sections and built another box and used that instead. When they couldn't get their hands on copper, because there's no copper mines in the Caribbean, when they couldn't get their hands on copper, they just started using like cast iron and things that they could fabricate. And so you'll see chamber stills that have like big rivets on them, and that's just steel, and they're being held together. And so essentially you don't get the alembic and the swan neck approach, which is going to cause the alcohol vapor to slow down and make the spirit better, because they didn't care about that. They were trying to make fuel with that device. So why spend the money and the time, and why slow down the process if you're not going to drink it? So that's what the chamber still was all about. And there were chamber stills in central United States along the Atlantic coast. There were chamber stills in New York. There were chamber stills in Boston. People were making fuel. And I'm sure some people tried to drink that stuff, and I'm sure it was not very tasty. So they probably they probably put molasses in, and you start getting dark rum now. It's not aged rum, it's just dark rum. So what are they putting in it to make it palatable? Right. So again, these things are not right or wrong. These are technological developments, and these are markets that require a commodity, and they're working with what they have. So we can't fault people for doing that. You have this massive demand for rum globally, and you need to make it fast, and you need to make it inexpensive. And so this is what happened, and these are market conditions. And so you end up with the loss of identity for rum, unlike whiskey, in this particular environment, in my opinion, because now you're not worried about quality. You're not discussing how it's made. You're not talking about the progeny, the history, the techniques. You're not lauding your master distillers, your master blender. You're just talking about light and dark, and pretty soon about aliens and space monsters and mythical creatures and all of these things, because you don't want to talk about this is like you can either put this in your car or you can put it in your glass, and so that's what ultimately happened. Was the marketing kind of was so industrialized that it drove us away from an understanding of what rum really is, how it's made, what its history and techniques are, and its traditions. So to this day, we now think that rum has no rules. And we now think that rum is, light and dark, and they don't understand that, wait a minute, a Jamaican rum is not light or dark. Excuse me, if I said something like that, I think Joy Spence would crawl through the internet and slap me in the face. Jamaican rum is beautiful.
That's like a slapper, but I'm sure she got choice words.
So you have these amazing products being made by these incredibly talented people with these beautiful traditions and rules, And none of that's really being discussed. So this is how we ended up where we are today. And so that's why I think that ultimately we got to this place. And now that's starting to turn, and all the rum fans out there are learning a lot more. Richard Seal was a big part of that. There are lots of other rum producers involved, Luca Gargano, and any number of other rum producers involved in today's rum marketplace have been telling the true stories and the real history. And you have to do it in a way that doesn't neglect the industrial traditions as well, in my opinion. You know, the people did that for a reason, and they needed to. So you see here
the question actually is related. What came first, the increased demand for rum or the column still?
Oh, definitely the column still, I think.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't, that's an opinion that is not based on my research, but I don't think we had an environment where people were just saying, we need more rum. I think they were figuring out, Napoleon was trying to find a way to make sugar, which is why he invented, or had people invent that column still, why he laid out prizes, huge cash prizes for engineers to come up with a plan to make this faster and cheaper.
So it wasn't about improving efficiency for rum to sell more rum to meet demand. It was about a separate thing, and it happened to have this impact as well.
And the continued development of the column still seems, in my opinion, because of its basically entree into the scene at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I think it has always had a component of the Industrial Revolution because people were needing to make chemicals.
Yeah.
People were needing to make fuel.
Right.
Certainly you can use it to make rum, but there were other commodities being produced.
Yep.
So that gets us to the whole concept of rum having rules. And now, you know, Barbados, you have pot and twin column, and you're working from molasses, and there's a lot of other definition to this. This is an unbelievably abbreviated list here. Jamaica, pot and multi-column now with molasses. Martinique with the rum agricole, single column and juice. The Haitian Clarins are pot still in juice. In Brazil, the cachaças, you could have pot, you could have single, and you could have multi-column and from juice. And so those are rules that if you went to any of those nations and started talking to rum producers and said, I hear that rum has no rules, they'd be like, you're out of your mind. We all have tons of rules. And so these rules were fomented of war, of agriculture, of technology. You know, rum comes in this dizzying array because of these local traditions and local rules, just like whiskey, just like in the bourbon traditions, just like in the Irish whiskey and the Scotch whiskey traditions. And the regulating bodies that are managing this are, you know, in the Caribbean, you have the CARICOM community where they collaboratively work together as a community, but they also have their individual rules on their islands. In the United States, the TTB, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau, they used to be known as the ATF, but after Waco, Texas, they rebranded, and now they're the TTB. So
this is brilliant.
And then the French AOC regulation, the AOC regulates, you know, spirits, but they also do all kinds of other commodities and spices and foods and things like that. So you have an array of rules that are clearly defined in all different parts of the world. And just like whiskey, there is no overarching global definition of whiskey. There is no overarching global definition of rum. You could say that rum, the only rule globally would be that it's coming from cane juice or coming from cane, and whiskey, it's coming from grain. You know, you could kind of go to that point in both. So they're identical in terms of that. But we've been trained for so long to think about light and dark and stuff. But you know.
Yeah, that's actually segue to a question here. Now knowing that light and dark are not useful terms, but knowing that the general population still uses those terms, how do you bridge that gap? What categories of rum are useful?
Well, I think that Luca Gargano came up with this, what they call the Gargano definition. And I think that's a fantastic, very complicated, super geeky form of how to get into the intricacies of all these different types of rum. And so it certainly has its purpose. But I think for the general public who are just learning this information, I think it's a lot easier just to say that rum is aged or it's unaged. And it's either got additives or it doesn't. So you either have an unaged, unadulterated, or you have an aged and adulterated, or you have an unadulterated and adulterated. That's very important, because what you're dealing with now that's part of the discussion about what's a valuable rum versus a less expensive rum. Mm-hmm. So people who use pot stills and barrels and actually age their products will never put additives in them. Never. I've talked to so many very high-end rum producers, and like Richard Seal said to me, if you took my 12-year rum and put 25 grams of sugar in it, I would punch you in the face. You just don't go through all that time, all that cost, all that technique to get to a very difficult to get to flavor profile, and then just dump a bunch of sugar on it because I'm just going to add sugar. I'm just going to make it better. So what you have with people who are primarily adding sugar, and I would say copious amounts of sugar, that's just neutral spirit. It might even be fuel alcohol, that they're just putting stuff in to make it. The ones that are doing, 96 grams of sugar per liter, that's 23 teaspoons in a single bottle. If you put 23 teaspoons in a bottle of whiskey, the Scots would lose their minds, right? The bourbon makers would lose it. There would be riots in the streets if one bourbon producer was dumping
in the streets of Louisville.
Yeah. But in rum, because in many cases all of the rum in a certain nation is just made by one family, so they just do whatever they want, and they're also usually like the dictator, so they can do whatever the hell they want, and that's their rules, and then they say, oh, that's the rules of our nation.
Got it. So to summarize that, really what we're saying is, hey, let's at least get consumers understanding the difference between unaged and aged, and no additive versus additive, and that's a great step.
Yes.
To at least engage at a deeper level without going all the way to some really complicated system, which is great for people who are asking these questions in Crowdcast and us here, but it's probably not that useful for somebody who doesn't even have that basic understanding.
Exactly. And later on, when you do get that base of understanding, then you can go start, talking to Luca Gargano. And I think that's very fascinating. And it's a whole nother world that you can learn much more about. But in the meantime, I think we have to all immediately stop talking about rum as light and dark, because all that's telling you is how much food coloring was added. It's not telling you where it's from, how it's made, what's its raw material. I mean, when you think of bourbon, there's corn in that. But to be bourbon, it has to be 51% corn in the mash bill. There's barley and rye and wheat also in a mash bill typically. And so people have this inherent understanding of bourbon. They know that in Scotch, if they're drinking Scotch, that it was made in Scotland. If they know they're drinking Irish whiskey, that's probably 3 stills involved in the distillation process. People know these things about these products, but they don't know anything about rum because we just say, oh, it's dark. Well, that's not aged. So why are you paying more money for it because it's dark? What? Why is that dark bottle $10 more than the light bottle? Because they put in a quarter of a penny worth of food coloring. That doesn't tell you anything. So that's why we should talk about
handcrafted food coloring, Bailey.
Yes, handcrafted. Yes.
Yeah.
But if you talk about it in terms of aged and unaged, right there you've got value. If it was aged, there's a tremendous amount of evaporative loss, especially in the Caribbean or anywhere along the equator. You lose to the angel's share, but in return you get these amazing flavor profile or flavor components from the lignans and tannin in the wood. And so, like, a Barbados 12-year-old rum is losing between 6 and 8% to evaporation every year. So in 12 years, you've got 60%, 70% of the barrel has evaporated. It's gone, but you get these great flavors.
Yeah.
So that aged rum is way more valuable than the unaged rum. So you're talking about value cues. And anyone who's making a really good rum would never add sugar to it. So if you're adding additives, then that's telling you, again, it's a value cue that's not necessarily going to be like the top shelf rum. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just shouldn't be sold at, $100 a bottle because it's in a fancy piece of glass,
Cool.
So, yeah. Glass.
Yes, I wish I had one, but
to the greatest spirit, the one that unites us throughout history, and and it's the one that gives you the real sense of history and connection to this whole incredible world. So I'll stop sharing there, and we
That's
can talk.
awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for that. I haven't seen it presented in that way. So we'll have to keep that one going. Maybe we can do it live in full effect in at Tiki in person. But I thought that was really cool at the time. I know about those stills, but I hadn't seen it presented linearly that way and with the context of how and why. So I'm definitely learning from that as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
Rad. So yeah, I mean, we had questions along the way. Anything else you want to say in summation from your side?
No, I would just say, that anybody out there who's really interested in rums and has the opportunity to do more research into rums, I think you find an unbelievable experience. If you've never tried Claren, if you've never tried Cachaça, if you've never tried some of those beautiful, funky pot still rums from Jamaica, for example, or Guadeloupe, or the rum agricoles. It's just there's so much to play with. It's so beautiful. I'd really love to see more people experimenting with this and to really understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I love it, and I've referenced Wondrich a couple times, and he put something together for us that I've been doing where we taste some different styles, and I always find it, however you want to break it down, but even people in the trade who are fairly spirit knowledgeable find it amazing, the depth of sugarcane spirits in macro, right? When you can taste them side by side and see how different they are and why and all this. So I think the more we can do that collectively, as an industry, the more exciting it is for people, the more prepared they are to understand how to use it, programs and things like that. It's super cool.
Yeah, right on.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to bring you back in a moment to say goodbye. We're going to bring on Emily to fire off some questions. Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for your patience.
It was fascinating. Not patience, attention.
Yeah, look at that. Learning stuff here. All right. In a more lighthearted fashion. So let's talk about some things. And Tiki, weirdest thing you saw in Wildwood. Weirdest thing.
Oh man, I feel like the fact that whole community was like a step back in time. I feel like everything was kind of from the Jetsons, like very retro feeling. And like, I think just collectively as a community, it was like such a cool place to just like, there was not an area we went to that didn't feel like that. And I mean, maybe not weirdest, but coolest for sure. And to be so well preserved, I think is something that group and the people that live there must have worked on and decided about.
Yeah, I like the Jetsons reference. They actually call the Caribbean, that ramp, the Jetsons ramp, which I think is very descriptive.
I mean, it really, I feel like there's not another word for it. And it's definitely a reference I think most people are acquainted with, that you have a very distinct image in your head when you say that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's accurate.
Right. Next question. One word to describe Steve Casey.
Fucking magnificent.
Oh, boy. Wow.
Look at her.
Fair enough. Okay. Favorite Tiki by the Sea memory?
Oh, we went to that little like carnival, or like that little, we went on a Ferris wheel, like a bunch of rides and stuff. And I had not, the boardwalk. I had not been to, well, a boardwalk in general ever. And I had not been to ride a roller coaster or on a Ferris wheel in years. And it was just like, this is something that I wouldn't have done, and was really glad to get to swing through that as a part, and with all these like cool new people, and to be able to share those things.
Right on. Yeah, it's fun that nobody really knows what Wildwood is till they get there. And then it's quite the experience. It's fun watching people experience it for sure.
A well-kept secret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Favorite meal in Wildwood that my dad did not serve?
Well, you robbed me of my answer.
Yeah, it was the answer every time, and it was going to his head, So
let's see. I don't remember the name of the place, but we went to a place that had this like big patio that was kind of a dock, and it was like over the water. And yes, yeah. I feel like that felt like a very authentic sort of meal. I mean, outside of what your dad was cooking,
of course,
which must have been authentic because it was coming from a resident.
Authentic Jersey. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm finally going back get some.
I mean, this like crabbiness just adds to the value of that meal too.
It was made with crabbiness.
Yeah, like
resting bitch face.
Oh my God.
Well, you're speaking to me right here.
I'm Nevenglosky in my heart.
He's been through a lot of assistance. Let's just say that. Just don't be in his way. When he's pulling something off the grill, do not be in his way. All right. Tell us about what's up in Nashville. What's going on?
Oh, well, I mean, if you're talking about tiki things, we have some really cool tiki bars that have popped up in the last few years.
Yeah.
There's one called Pearl Diver and there's another called Chopper, both of which I frequented prior to COVID and have kind of started to like feel out after the fact. They're both being very respectful and very like good about regulations. But their menus are extensive, like you love to see at a tiki bar. The decor is like absolutely spot on with every detail thought of. And I think, well, I mean, they're both like very near to my house. So, and
that's convenient.
Also near to my heart for that reason.
Right on.
Beyond that, it's just business as usual. I mean, there's a lot of tourism. I've fortunately been able to kind of sidestep that by working in a neighborhood tangent to or adjacent to downtown, but not quite. And at least
Emily doesn't have to go on Broadway.
No, thank goodness. Bypass it altogether and never see it.
Steva, what did I miss?
Oh, what did you miss? Well, first of all, big hearts to Pearl Diver.
Love
them. I think that's all. I mean, Wildwood is Wildwood. Like the great thing about it is like when we finally get to go back, it is a place completely frozen in time. So
yeah, didn't change.
When we get to go back, it'll be like
exactly the same.
Yeah. It's a beach town as a beach town. The thing I appreciate about Beach Creek is how Emily, I don't know if you grew up going to the Gulf Coast as a kid, but it has a very Gulf Coast feel to me.
Right on. Awesome. Well, glad to see you. Well, let me pop this up. 2 weeks from now, we have Shannon Mustapher back. You guys all know her. Talking classical tropical builds, contemporary ingredients and techniques, really oriented to home. So what you can do at home. So that'll be super rad. Please join us then. Let me get Bailey back on here. Good, sir. Thanks again.
Sure.
Always a pleasure.
That Shannon piece looks awesome. I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, yeah.
She was such a great presenter.
She's amazing. She's amazing.
Yeah. She actually went to Tiki #1. And apparently that sparked some interest and has eclipsed us many years ago.
One of our other Tiki by the Sea alumni, whose name is Fernando Sousa, is in the world class competition today. So if you guys when you leave this, you should watch Fernando Sousa.
Such a good guy.
It's amazing.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great to see you guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Everybody be safe. Good luck with the still, Bailey. Send some photos.
Come over to Connecticut sometime. Check it out.
Well, I'll hopefully be back Northeast in May. So I'd love to do it. Love to see it.
Right on. We're in Mystic, Connecticut. All right.
Oh, yeah. Pizza. Get some distillation. Exactly. Right on. All right, guys.